Guten Tag, APUSH. We have a new video today. It's the bee's knees by the big cheese himself, Mr. Linegar. Let's make history today as we jaw over Unit 7, Day 2. But first, let's do our daily punishment. What did the grape say when it got crushed? Nothing. It just let out a little whine. Whine! All right. Key terms for today are the GI Bill, the White Flight, Levittown, Suburbs, the Fair Deal, the Cult of Domesticity, the Election of 1948, the Point 4 Program, the Taft-Hartley Act. We're going to go over life in the 1940s, political changes, domestic changes, cultural changes in the 1940s, and like I said, Harry Truman's domestic policy. Last class we talked about foreign policy in the Cold War. This time we're talking about his domestic policy. In 1948, Harry Truman's going to run for re-election. Everybody counted Truman out. He really was not that popular by 48. The Republicans had gained seats in the Senate and House. The Southern Democrats did not like Harry Truman because he desegregated the Army. So the Southern Democrats are going to break off and form their own third party called the Dixiecrats, led by Strom Thurmond. Harry Truman, even though he was from Missouri, he is going to desegregate the Army. He will do stuff for African Americans. Ever since the 1930s, African Americans had been slowly going to the Democratic Party. The Progressive Party did not like Truman either. They thought he was too aggressive and too anti-communist. So the former vice president under FDR, Wallace, is going to run a third party against Truman. Henry Wallace thought Uncle Joe Stalin, was a good guy and that America were the ones that were being the bad guys in the Cold War. They thought we were being too aggressive. He will eventually regret some of his things as he sees what the communist system is really about. But basically, the Democratic Party is broken into three, so everybody thought the Republicans would win. But in the election of 1948, Truman is going to actually defeat the Republican candidate, Thomas Dewey. Some newspapers had already printed that Dewey defeated Truman, but he will not. This actually shows the map of the election of 1948. Truman wins. Let's talk about some of the societal changes in the 1940s, and a lot of this also applies to the 1950s, which we'll be talking about the next 2 days after this. We're going to have 15 million soldiers return after World War II. This is 11.3% of the population. There will be some programs created to help out the returning World War II vets. The biggest bill you should know for this class is the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, also known more informally as the GI Bill. Under the GI Bill, veterans are guaranteed loans for homes, farms, small businesses. Also for colleges, it's going to allow them, the GI Bill will allow them to go to college. So you're going to see a lot of World War II vets as they return going to college, getting education, and getting loans to get houses. This is going to lead to the rise of the suburbs and suburbanization. After World War II, you're going to see more and more African Americans and Native Americans migrate to the north and the west. This is kind of a continuation of the Great Migration. You're going to see more people moving from rural to urban migration. You're going to see increase in population in the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt is the southern part of the United States, but it also includes western states. The Sun Belt predominantly, we talk about like population increase in the Sun Belt. It's predominantly like Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California. But the Sun Belt's going to become much more populated during this time after World War II. There is going to be increase in racial tensions as African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans returned from World War II. Remember, we had the Double V campaign for African Americans. They'd fought against fascist racism in Europe, and now they want equal rights returning. But the Southerners do not want to give them equal rights. Jim Crow laws in the South will become even more cruel. Southerners will not be willing to give them rights after these heroes fought for their country. And this is going to lead to the civil rights movements of the 1950s, 1960s. Here's the Sun Belt. Let's talk about gender in the 1940s and 1950s. you're going to see a return to the cult of domesticity. During World War II, we had Rosie the Riveter. American women were working in factories. Ever since like the Gibson Girl in the late 1890s, women were slowly getting rights. But really, this is a retreat for women during this time. Women had entered the workplace at greater numbers during the war. After World War II, women are going to return home. A lot of them are going to stay home. It's going to be a return to the cult of domesticity, cooking, cleaning, having babies. A lot of the stereotype things you see here, cult of domesticity. And we'll talk about that more in the 1950s. After World War II, there is going to be huge economic growth in America. You're going to have strong economy and income. You're going to have a rise of a middle class in the United States. There's going to be an increase of a car culture for easier travel to and from the suburbs. You're going to have mass exodus of white people from urban to suburban areas. The urban areas start to have more and more African Americans as African Americans move north. A lot of the white racist people do not want to be neighbors to African Americans. So you're going to see them move to the suburbs outside the cities. Because of this, the tax base of the inner cities is going to start to decay, and their social programs are going to start to decrease. The whole movement from white people out of the cities is called the white flight. Also, what you're going to have during this time is you're going to have the rise of suburbanization, which we talked about. One of the big ideas of how the suburbs look like was a very designed house system. It's called Levittown. Levittown is the name of several large suburban housing developments created in the U.S. by William Levitt and his company, Levitt & Sons. After World War II, returning veterans and their new families are going to be offered attractive loans because of the GI Bill. The Veterans Administration, the Federal Housing Administration, it's going to guarantee them housing. The first Levittown houses will sell for $7,900, which is a deal even back then. Over 17,000 units are going to be sold, providing homes for 84,000 people. In addition, for the dwellings, it's also going to provide places for private areas, swimming pools, public parks, and recreational facilities. Levittowns are going to be molded and based off of the assembly line in 27 steps. So they're all going to look very similar. Sometimes they're described as cookie cutter. A house could be built in one day with 36 men when effectively scheduled. It's going to allow for quick and economic production of similar or identical houses with rapid recovering. So one of the things you're going to see in the suburbs is all the houses start to look alike. Standard Levittown houses will include a white picket fence, American Dream, green lawns, modern appliances. They're going to start in 1947. 1,400 houses will be sold within the first 3 hours. Levittowns are a really big deal. A lot of times it's used synonymously for like suburbanization in the 40s and 50s, but they're a big deal of what's going on in this time. Here are some examples of Levittowns. This is a bird's eye view, but they all do look the same. Here's a Levittown right here. White family, obviously. If you're African American, you're moving to the inner city, and the houses are definitely not as nice. A lot of this whole American dream and like suburbanization is only for whites. Racism. Although like African Americans and Hispanics did apply under the GI Bill. Just because of redlining and blockbusting, a lot of times they couldn't move into these like Levittown houses in the suburbs. Remember redlining and blockbusting. It's the idea of like informal segregation where they wouldn't, real estate agents would not allow minorities to buy houses in the suburbs. All right, lastly, let's talk about Harry Truman's domestic policy. Harry Truman wants to expand upon the New Deal. He calls his program the Fair Deal, and you should know that. He wants to increase money for housing, GI Bill. He wants to increase Social Security. He wants to have full employment. He wants to increase minimum wage, more farm support. He wants to have a new TVA. Some of these things will happen. There will be an increase in housing, obviously. We will have increase in Social Security. He really doesn't do anything completely radical except for the housing and the GI Bill, which actually was passed before him, because the GI Bill was passed in 1944, although Truman's the one that enforces it. One of Truman's other big ideas was the Point Four program. This was the idea that people, instead of joining the army, they could join a program where they go overseas and try to help developing third world nations. It's the beginning idea of the Peace Corps, which JFK will take that idea and create the Peace Corps when John F. Kennedy is president. He'll steal the idea. One of the laws that's going to be passed by Congress, because Republicans have control over Congress, will be the Taft-Hartley Act. Harry Truman was a Democrat, so he supported labor unions. He'll veto this law, but Congress overrides his veto with 2/3 majority. The Taft-Hartley Act will limit labor unions. It's going to prohibit unions from engaging in several unfair labor practices, like jurisdictional strikes, wildcat strikes. It prevents it gets rid of the whole idea of closed shops that you have to join a labor union. It limits monetary donations to political parties for labor unions. It was really trying to cut some of what Republicans saw as the more excessive aspects of like the Wagner Act and the labor laws that were passed under FDR. It was meant to limit labor unions. And Truman will try to get rid of this. If you're a labor person, you hate this law. It's probably the most anti-labor law passed in the last 80 years, but it will be passed, and it's still law today. All right, kiddos. That's all I have for you for today. We'll be talking about the 1950s, the next two classes. Until next time, deuces. Deuces, yeah.